Thanks for reminding me. All right, cool. So, well, actually, now I regret having resumed the recording. So I took care of that now. So now recording. If you go back to Plato's Ion, and this is on page 54 in our text, he says, so Socrates says to Ion, the gift which you possess of speaking excellently about Homer is not an art, it's not techne, but as I was just saying, an inspiration. There's a divinity moving you like that contained in the stone, which Euripides calls a magnet. Euripides is going to be important for our discussion of Nietzsche, by the way. So we can go on. The stone not only attracts iron rings, but also imparts to them similar power of attracting other rings. And sometimes you may see a number of pieces of iron and rings suspended from one another so as to form quite a long chain. And all of them derive their power of suspension from the original stone. In like manner, the muse first of all inspires men herself, and from these inspired persons, a chain of other persons is suspended who take the inspiration. For all good poets, epic as well as lyric, compose their beautiful poems not by art, but because they are inspired and possessed. So that's the poetic side of the story, in contradistinction to techne as a mode of determinate, more or less self-clear knowledge. And then here's a part that's really important for our discussion of Nietzsche. And as the Corybantian revelers, when they dance, are not in their right mind, so the lyric poets are not in their right mind when they are composing their beautiful strains. But when falling under the power of music, so you can see the Dionysian origin of music here, as far back as Plato's account. Under the power of music and meter, they are inspired and possessed, like Bacchic maidens who draw milk and honey from the rivers when they are under the influence of Dionysus, but not when they are in their right mind. So there's the figure of Dionysus. The Roman counterpart, so in the Roman pantheon, is Bacchus. So that's why the word Bacchic is presented there. I'm not sure what the word would be in the Greek. I imagine it would just be Dionysian. I'm not sure about that English translation. As they themselves say, for they tell us that they bring songs from honeyed fountains, culling them out of the gardens and dells of the Muses. They, like the bees, winging their way from flower to flower. For the poet is a light and winged and holy thing, and there is no invention in him until he has been inspired and is out of his senses, and the mind is no longer in him. When he has not attained to this state, he is powerless and is unable to utter his oracles. So the account given in response to Ion's question, to Ion's problem on the part of Socrates in this early dialogue of Plato, is one of a Dionysian explanation of the very nature and origins of art in its relationship to beauty, nature, and the realm of the gods, which means that for the artist himself or herself, in the state of production, being literally out of her mind is in fact in a state vis-a-vis the content of the artistic production in a state of unknowing, gripped by inspiration. So just as when actors present what you might understand as simulated emotions based upon the character that they're representing in the narrative context in which the action takes place, their state of experience and capacity to feel is pushed away to make room for this sort of strange other mind, other presence, other consciousness. And so Nietzsche is making the argument that this way of thinking about the role and skill of the actor goes all the way back to these conditions in the cult of Dionysus. So that's, if you did the reading for today, you know that that is the very beginning of tragedy in the place of, or in the role of the chorus, right? The tragic chorus. That first of all came about by this weird band of revelers who come together to sing in drunken ecstasy praises to the god of wine, the god of fertility, the god of chaos, Dionysus. And from that chorus of Dionysian revelers, which is known as the dithyramb, you get dithyrambic poetry, which is supposed to be a kind of lyric poetry. So a very emotionally charged, kind of sub-intellectual poetic pronouncement, the material of which is taken from the affective emotional conditions of the subject experiencing the state of ecstasy. And from that fertile historical ground, you get the development of the mature form of tragedy. And then that had a particular heyday, and it came to a point of relative corruption and decay in the last great tragic poet, Euripides, whom many of his contemporaries thought that he destroyed the tragic art, along whom would be the figure of Aristophanes, the famous comic poet. And so we'll look at a poem actually written, thousands of years ago by Aristophanes at the time of Euripides, where he's, talking shit about Euripides, and Nietzsche does the same thing. And it's important to note that Socrates was kind of unique at the moment of classical Hellenic culture at this point in Athens, insofar as he, in terms of these famous figures alone, seemed to admire Euripides above all the other tragic poets, including Sophocles and Aeschylus, so the first of the tragic poets. And that's because of a profound intellectualism that runs through the Euripidean transformation of the art, which is too much Apollonian. And so the Apollonian side, now represented by Socrates, so we'll see on Thursday when we continue the reading, Nietzsche refers to this as aesthetic Socratism in like a negative kind of pejorative way, spelled the end of tragedy in terms of what it has to teach us about life, and its kind of strong metaphysical role. Okay. So I'm going to pull up my slides and we'll begin working through those. And then we'll take a little bit of a break in 10 minutes or so. And again, as always, if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question, feel free to unmute and interrupt me or throw something in the chat. I'll periodically check on the chat. All right. So just very quickly, a brief overview, much of which we've already gotten today from the videos. So Nietzsche was trained as a classical philologist, and we no longer really refer to these figures in academia as philologists. It's sort of an outdated term or designation, at least in the US or North America. So these are academics we now know as classicists. So as a philologist, Nietzsche was an expert scholar on interpreting ancient texts and bridging the gap, as it were, between the historical origins of these texts and the present or contemporary, in this case, we're talking about the 19th century interpretation or appropriation of them. And so as a philologist, Nietzsche held a professorship in philology in Basel when he was very young. And there's an inaccuracy. So here's one more inaccuracy of that first School of Philosophy video where it said he composed this first book, The Birth of Tragedy, after he left his post. That's not true. That was the one book that he wrote while occupying the professorship in philology in Basel. And this alienated a number of, not all of them, he had some supporters and some like-minded academics at that institution, but they were largely not in philology. They were in literature, history, and to some extent, philosophy. And so he became alienated from his colleagues because they were a little bit suspicious of his methodology and some of the cavalier strong claims that he arrived at in terms of his conclusive interpretations and so forth. And he attempted to move at a certain point before leaving academia entirely. And there are many reasons for that decision. But before jumping on it, he attempted to move from philology to philosophy at Basel. And the philosophy department rejected him. And so he basically quit academia. He moved to the Swiss Alps and basically hiked for the remainder of his life, looking for the bodily health that he never enjoyed because he was plagued by debilitating illnesses his entire life. And so after the birth of tragedy, he published the remainder of his important works as an independent scholar. So he's exerted a profound influence on philosophy, literary criticism, psychology, very importantly. So he was profoundly important for the development of Freudian psychoanalysis. So we consider him a philosopher, but he's also a kind of proto-psychologist. And the same can be said for other early European existentialists or proto-existentialists like Soren Kierkegaard, who had many profoundly influential and illuminating things to say about the state of anxiety, for example, the subjective condition or experience of anxiety. And so, yeah, we'll talk a lot about important psychological upshots or important points to draw from his thinking. So yeah, I mentioned the damage that had been done to tarnish his reputation by his anti-Semitic proto-Nazi sister, Elizabeth Nietzsche, who took on the role of popularizing his ideas after he suffered a complete and irreversible mental breakdown at the age of 45 after the apocryphal incident with the horse in Turin in Italy. So Nietzsche, though, explicitly despised anti-Semitism and nationalism. In fact, although a German, he had many critical negative things to say about the Germans. He didn't like them. He thought that compared to, say, the French, they lacked creativity, they lacked deep culture, and he saw a tendency towards violent jingoism in their sort of cultural attitude, which makes him a bit prescient in terms of what would come to be in the middle of the 20th century. But he was no longer alive to see that happen, to see the rise of the Nazis, who would, again, try to appropriate Nietzsche for their own Nazi ends as a kind of Germanic hero. So he's a major figure then in the advent and development of existential and postmodern philosophy. So you might trace postmodernism back to a particular statement expressed in The Gay Science, one of his major works, which is, there are no facts, there are only interpretations. And so we can see this contribution, this influence characterized by these 2 points. So one, a deep suspicion of grand, universal, and romantic narratives, an extreme version of which we talked about for the last couple of weeks in the context of Hegelian romanticism. And then 2, a more robust and positive role given to irrational motive forces, such as instinct, impulse, risk-taking, and passion, which previous philosophers under the narcotic spell of Platonism, which would include even Aristotle, relegated to a lower order of human reality that would have to just be controlled by the rational intellect. And so some of his most notable contributions to philosophy would include, and these are some ideas that were presented in the first video, the Death of God Thesis, anticipation and warning about the coming of European nihilism. So this attitude on the part of European culture, such that truth is an impossibility and nothing is meaningful. And this is directly related, in fact, to the Death of God Thesis, such that because faith is waning in the 19th century, the 20th century, and we can see the status of that in our worldly context in the 21st century now. there was a question as to what would come to fill that hole opened up at the decline of belief, of religious commitment and belief. So that's where this concern over nihilism comes in. And then the theory of perspectivism, and we don't really have to get into all of these things, but if you have questions about them, I can make some comments to clarify. This thought experiment, you might say, the eternal recurrence or eternal return of the same, his mature idea, this sort of metaphysical principle, the will to power, and then there's the theory of the transvaluation, or the so-called revaluation of all values, whereby through the slave revolt and morality, the sort of Christian priestly orientation to life, which is a sort of negative no-saying to life, overcame and replaced the previous Greek heroic conception of a more life-affirming attitudinal awareness. Okay. So any questions on this biography stuff? Feel free to jump in, but just some context on the birth of tragedy. So this was published in 1872, at which point we're dealing with a very young Nietzsche. So he's only 28 years old, and his colleagues in philology thought it to be too speculative and ultimately too philosophical. So not strictly classical. And so he tried unsuccessfully, as I mentioned, to move to philosophy, and then after that he left academia. But the aim of the book is to give a kind of genealogy of Greek tragedy, to trace it back to its incipient sort of pre-cultural origins, that is to say, its origins in nature as such. So according to Nietzsche, art, at least as we understand it in the so-called Western world, first emerged in the Greek world out of the kind of unstable marriage of two contrary impulses represented by the gods Apollo and Dionysus. So respectively, among a number of other things, the deities of sculpture and music. So Apollo is the patron deity behind sculpture as an art form, and then Dionysus plays that role for music. Now, Nietzsche argues that tragedy first appeared in the work of Aeschylus, so he's the first of the three major tragedians, as an Apollonian translation. So this Apollonian kind of alignment with the structured, the clear, the intelligible, a kind of Apollonian translation into more or less clear dream images as reflections of a dark, chaotic, and therefore Dionysian substratum of impetuses and impulses that prior to this unstable marriage was previously expressed in the lyric. And so we're all familiar with the idea of lyrics, right? Song lyrics, principally. But lyric poetry arose out of dithyrambic poetry. And so is anyone who's familiar at all formally, systematically with the history of poetry or the practice of poetry to say anything about the lyrical variety? Does anyone know about poetry to that extent?
I do not.
Okay. Well, this is something we'll talk about too. We'll continue this next week. We'll talk about lyric poetry in the context of the expressivist theory of art with Benedetto Croce, the Italian philosopher, who was, I would say, critically influenced by Nietzsche. So he was sort of reacting strongly against Nietzsche and making a kind of move towards a return to Hegelian romanticism to some extent. So we'll see that next week. But lyric poetry is ultimately emotional poetry. That is to say, it's not narrative, as we find, for example, in Homer. So a lyric poet is simply trying to manifest or express through poetic language what it is that they're feeling. So you might say to take their interior life of sentiment and feeling and to make it available or open for the experience of others. Okay. And so a dithyramb, this is why it's called dithyrambic poetry, which ultimately made lyric poetry possible. A dithyramb, and so going back to, well, actually, he doesn't use it here in the Ion, but a dithyramb was a wild choral hymn, so a kind of song or an early poem that would be sung, usually with an accompaniment of the lyre. And so this is the origin of the name lyric. So lyrics were performed in song with the accompaniment of an instrument known as the lyre, which is similar to a guitar, right? So it's a kind of stringed instrument. And so a dithyramb was a wild choral hymn, so a hymn that would be sung by a chorus in praise of the god Dionysus. And thus the chorus was the first formal element of tragedy. And that's the kind of claim that Nietzsche argues for and defends towards the middle of our reading, to which subsequently actors in a dramatic story were added as other later formal components to tragedy as a unique and whole art form. And so the three major tragic poets of the classical Greek world, as I mentioned before, there's Aeschylus, followed by Sophocles, and then Euripides, each having introduced a new invention or literary device to the tragic form. So it's really through Sophocles that the chorus, originally the ground and context for the dithyrambic display of lyrical passion, expanded into a kind of performance and narrative with actors and a story and so forth. And then Euripides is the last important figure in the tradition, and he was a contemporary of Socrates. And so I mentioned that Socrates appreciated his tragedies more than the others, more than Sophocles or Aeschylus. And so Socrates, as I mentioned, was unique in this because most cultured Greeks at the time thought quite differently, that Euripides represented a decline in this art form. And Nietzsche is in agreement with that attitude. So Nietzsche agrees with that critical consensus that Euripides was a comparatively inferior poet who undermined the tragic art form and paved the way for its ultimate disappearance, its dissolution. And it did really disappear as a Greek form of poetic production in the classical world. And he argues that this corruption occurred under the influence of Socrates' optimistic dialectic, through which all obscurity, chaos, and untruth can be transformed through logical reasoning into clarity, order, and truth with no real remainder. Now, this is one interpretation of the Socratic figure and the Socratic philosophy. And for my mind, I'm not entirely persuaded by Nietzsche's interpretation of Socrates. I think his view of him is a bit harsh, and he misses some of the nuance that we can pull out of Plato's work. And that's a little curious to me, given that Nietzsche was a classical philologist, right? And he actually makes some poor interpretive translational moves in some of his works in order to, in an illegitimate way, I would suggest, bolster his argument. So for example, in Twilight of the Idols, one of Nietzsche's last works, he comments negatively on Socrates' purported last words, which are expressed in Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo. And those last words are, just before Socrates drinks the poison, drinks the hemlock, he says, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Asclepius was the god of health. But Nietzsche renders that in his own translation into German, I owe a cock to Asclepius. And then he uses that to argue that Socrates is saying, my disease, of which I'm now to be cured, was life. and I hate life. So now that I'm dying, I'm going to be happy and I'm cured of the illness. But Plato does not write that. He writes, we owe a cock to Asclepius, which again is not a penis. I should clarify, it's a rooster to be sacrificed to this god of health. And the we suggests that it can't just be that Socrates is being cured of life understood as a disease, because he's the only one dying, right? So then a better interpretation of what he means there is that his friends, including himself at this moment, have been, through arguments, disabused and cured of their fear of death. So that's really the illness that plagued them. But that's just to say that we don't have to 100% throw our understanding behind Nietzsche's provocative and tendentious interpretations of these things.
Sadly, I feel like I'm becoming more like Nietzsche and just more and more pessimistic every day. I used to be a naive optimist, but long gone are the days.
Well, I would argue that Nietzsche is fairly optimistic, and I think that he's usually interpreted wrongly in the other direction, but we can say more about that. But let's take a break.
I have a question before we take a break,
Yeah,
and
sure.
it's not really, it is relevant to what was just being discussed, but not necessarily to the slides. Do you think that people would see Nietzsche's ideas differently if we called him Friedrich more often?
I don't know. Why do you ask?
Well, Nietzsche is a harsher word than Friedrich, and although I don't actually often hear him compared to Nazis, but I do hear him being like compared to nihilists at large.
Oh yeah, that's a common misinterpretation. But
I do wonder if a change in branding is what's needed, because it does seem like his ideas get a little bit, can seem like he's darker than he is.
Yeah, I don't know. I think a better solution would would be for people to actually read.
Perhaps.
Which I know is a lot to ask, but
I guess my comment was more just on like being kind of critical around things like alcohol. Like I'm like, I don't drink alcohol. I've never had that. Times I have, it's been a horrible experience, and I'll never do it again. Just like different things where like, oh yeah, Christianity, like, you know, just like kind of just very like, no, not my thing. Just like, but also I mean, so far, like 80% of it he's saying aligns with my personal values, but just that kind of like, I guess stubborn, like, oh yeah, not for me kind of thing.
Yeah, contrarian, maybe that's a good way to put it, rather than pessimistic.
Yeah,
with
that's probably more suiting.
Yeah, to the dominant or popular attractions or ideas of a particular day, right? And that's certainly true of Nietzsche.
My personal philosophy is like, so everyone like, lots of people like, oh, have a balanced whatever view on things, you know, like I take what the extremes are and go in the middle. Well, I think humanity is kind of silly. So if you go in the middle, like the real truth's over here and humanity's kind of over here. So you're gonna be in the left field or the right field, like pretty far out if you're gonna be in the balanced spot. I don't know. But
yeah. Cool. All right, guys, let's take a brief break. So let's come back at like 2:46. I think that's about 5 minutes or so. So I'll pause the recording. Let's get back to it. So I saw the chat. Are nature documentaries a Dionysian form of art? I wouldn't say so. What do you guys think?
That's an interesting take. I thought that they would be because of how like just grim they can be, and
I see.
And like the subject matter in particular, that being nature, is very raw. Well, it is raw and it's authentic on the part of the animals, usually one assumes, and even on the part of the documentary filmmakers, there's a code of ethics, right, that they can't interfere with what's happening and make it look pretty.
Yeah, but there seems to be a kind of mediation that renders the whole horror of the scene palatable and intelligible for the viewer, such that you feel edified,
Mhm.
instructed, having watched it, and you're
This is
comfortably
true.
removed from the terror of the primal natural setting. So to that extent, I would say no. But I imagine there
Mm.
could be some like weird experimental nature documentaries that could,
Yeah, come to think of it,
yeah,
I bet a true Dionysian nature documentary would be disgusting.
yeah. Uh, yeah, I imagine if you're familiar with the German filmmaker Werner Herzog, he might make a Dionysian um, nature documentary if you were ever disposed to do that. Um, okay, cool. So, but to just go to the beginning of the text, did anyone notice the joke that Nietzsche begins with? It's kind of a subtle joke in the very first paragraph. I mean, really, the first sentence, you find the joke.
Oh yeah, about the duality of the sexes involving perpetual strife. I
Yeah,
caught that.
exactly. Just as procreation depends on the duality of the sexes involving perpetual strife with only periodically intervening reconciliations. So he's saying, in terms of the typical relation between the genders or the sexes, it's fraught with antagonism. And only occasionally will they be reconciled for reasons of procreation. Right? So it's a sort of joke on um, the relations between at least the binary sexes at this point in the 19th century. So let's jump back to the presentation. So here we're going to get a little bit more detail on the nature of these deities, which are thrust into a kind of fruitful antagonism or opposition. So we have on the left here, Apollo, god of the sun, god of light, knowledge, healing, poetry, archery, and also prophecy. And that's something important to keep in mind that we'll return to. He was the leader of the Muses. And so the Muses were the Muses of Apollo. So these sort of semi-deities, these strange hybrid figures, mythological beings, were, as we learned from the Ion, um, occupying an intermediate metaphysical status between the gods and the realm of the mortals. So they would do the work that is the communicative, disclosive work of the god Apollo, bringing truths through art, right, through the intelligibility of the poetic dream language. And the plastic arts, like for example, so when Nietzsche talks about the plastic arts, he's talking about not art objects that are made out of the material we know as plastic. He's using the word plastic as an adjective, which means that which can be, as a material presence, formed, shaped, pulled, stretched, manipulated, put into an infinite variety of figures. So that's the god Apollo. And so he's one of the 12 Olympian gods. So the Olympian gods followed the Titanic regime, right? So one of the 12 Olympian gods who, led by Zeus, overthrew those Titan gods who came before them. And the oracle at Delphi, so the very place that's inscribed with the famous "Know thyself," the very place that Socrates' friend and companion Chaerephon went to consult the priestess that said Socrates is the wisest of all humans. So there's another important connection between the god Apollo and Socrates that Nietzsche is going to emphasize in a variety of ways, especially towards the end of the reading that we'll take up on Thursday. So this oracle at Delphi, the most important of all the ancient Greek temples, was where the priestess to Apollo could be consulted for divine guidance and insight into the future. So that's the prophetic element or function of this deity. Now, by contrast, we have on the right Dionysus, god of wine, fertility, divine madness, so possession. You should remember what we talked about earlier today, taking us back to the context of the Ion, back to Plato, right? Theater and religious ecstasy. In the Roman pantheon, so this god is Bacchus, hence the adjective Bacchic, as opposed to Dionysian. So Dionysus, or Bacchus, was also one of the 12 Olympians, along with Apollo, his brother, then you could say, who defeated the Titanic ones. So as we mentioned earlier, dithyrambic choruses, the original element of the tragic theater, consisted of revelers. So imagine a group of drunkards on like 1 a.m. on New Year's Eve, like stumbling down the street singing. That's sort of what this ancient dithyrambic chorus was like. So there's this kind of, again, orgiastic ecstasy through which is channeled the spirit of Dionysus, singing his praises in obscure, mystical, lyrical, that is, and we can define lyrical, so that's why I have it in blue here. So again, just as a reminder to give you a sense of what I'm doing with these colors, this color scheme, whenever I have something in the pale blue, that means we're dealing with a definition that's somewhere around here getting defined or clarified. So lyrical means relating to passion and feeling. So in these praises would be sung in these weird lyrical songs. And that's, according to Nietzsche, the origin of the tragic theater. And so now we'll start working through the various sections of the text. So for today's discussion, we were assigned the first 8 of the chapters, the sections, and then we'll finish that up. I believe the final section for our reading for Thursday is 15. So we'll finish that up for Thursday. So in the first section is where Nietzsche sets up this important duality or dichotomy as artistic forces that burst forth, he says on page 502, burst forth from nature herself without the mediation of the human artist. So in subsequent sections, he's going to talk about how the Apollonian Dionysian dichotomy works in the production of human art on the basis of the human artist, that is to say, giving us some sense of aesthetic mediation. So here he's really talking about the origin at the deepest level, coming from nature itself. So the Apollonian impulse, we have these 2 impulses. So the Apollonian impulse, it's in dreams, and so you should start to recognize, to the extent that you're familiar with this stuff in the history of psychology, you might start to recognize some Freudian elements. So again, I mentioned at the beginning that Nietzsche was very important in terms of his influence on Freud. So it's in dreams that the very notion of divinity, according to Nietzsche, first appeared to human beings. So in dreams, he says, on page 499, we delight in the immediate apprehension of form. So in dreams, whatever pleasure we enjoy is because we're immersed in a state of the immediate apprehension of form. And this is accompanied or attended by a sense of satisfaction. And so what is it about dreams that give us this immediate apprehension of form? That is, without mediation, without separation? Well, because in the dream, there's only form. That is, there's only form or image with no underlying materiality to confuse or distract us. So your dream is like an original theater space in which you only care about appearances. So remember, going back to Hegel, even nature deals with appearances. So that's why the criticism of what artists put forward into the world, such that artists are engaging in a kind of illusory deception, is misguided for Hegel because nature too issues in appearances. But as Hegel noted, there's something false about the way in which our everyday lives engage with the appearance of forms, insofar as there's some messiness, there's some dark, confusing material that is purely natural, non-spiritual element. Well, Nietzsche isn't thinking in that direction, but we can in any case find an affinity between his thought here and Hegel, such that in the dream world, you dream of a human figure. It could be yourself or someone else, perhaps a new person that you don't even know. And there is no material bodily presence there. It's just a pure superficial image like you see on the screen in a cinema, right? So on page 500, he continues, this joyful necessity of the dream experience has been embodied by the Greeks in their god Apollo. For Apollo, the god of all plastic, so we might say formative. Remember, plastic is an adjective meaning the capacity to manipulate, stretch, alter, and figure a given material in a variety of ways. So Apollo is the god of all plastic or formative energies. He's at the same time the soothsaying god, so future telling. He is the so-called shining one, the deity of light. And he's also the ruler over the fair appearance of the inner world of fantasy, which is comparable to the dream state, the literal dream state in which we find ourselves at night. So then the higher truth, the perfection of these states, in contrast to the everyday world, which is not completely 100% capable of being made sense of. It's not entirely intelligible. This deep consciousness of nature, healing and helping in sleep and dreams, is at the same time the symbolic analog of the soothsaying faculty and the arts generally, which make life possible and worth living. So does this make sense? Where dreams come into the picture under the aegis of the Apollonian god, the figure of Apollo. So in a dream, I mean, Freud, remember, if you know anything about Freud, thinks about dreams as a wish fulfillment on the basis of what's given as material from the subconscious or the unconscious, which is like the bulk of, say, to use this metaphor, an iceberg below the surface of what is seen. So there are irrational, contradictory elements at play in the dream. But Nietzsche's pointing out how in the dream, since we're dealing with pure appearance, pure image, and this is one way maybe to explain the necessity in terms of our biological organism of dreams. So we are, and this is what some contemporary neuroscientists and other related scholars think about. So in cognitive science, think about dreams. Everyone dreams, whether you're remembering them or not, when you awake. And that's how our very cognitive structure is able to work through the overwhelming, chaotic, and for that reason, potentially undermining forces of our unconscious. And so that's a kind of catharsis of our very consciousness that occurs without any deliberate effort on our part at night when we're asleep. And so what is obscure, what is perhaps plaguing us and undermining our very drives in a number of invisible ways in our waking life, these subterranean forces are transformed in the dreamscape. If you can, for example, recollect in any vivid way your dreams, they're transformed into more or less clear images. So that's the Apollonian function of dreams. What is obscure is rendered a pure image that is thus set before you, teased apart from you, and given to your immediate apprehension, even though it's a kind of dreamlike oneric apprehension or attention within the scope of the dream. And this has some sort of salutary, that is, health making quality to it. So importantly for Nietzsche, drawing on the influence of Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer is included in our textbook, so selections from his major work, The World as Will and Representation, that's actually the chapter preceding in our textbook, The Birth of Tragedy. I love Schopenhauer, but unfortunately, we only have so much time, so we can't read Schopenhauer. But I would recommend it. Unlike Nietzsche, Schopenhauer is explicitly a pessimist. He refers to himself as a pessimist, and he's also very self-confident. Schopenhauer is very confident that he is right, everyone else is wrong. He was committed to his view, his judgment that Hegel was a complete charlatan who deserved no respect. And Schopenhauer would deliberately schedule his own lectures to compete with Hegel at the same time. But unhappily, nobody would go to Schopenhauer's lectures. And so that would just enrage him even more. And if you know what Schopenhauer looks like, it's even funnier. So I encourage you to pull up a Google image of Schopenhauer. But okay. So still at this early stage of his philosophical career, Nietzsche was under the influence of Schopenhauer, although he would later part ways with him, at least in terms of his positive philosophy. Apollo is the one who supplies what Nietzsche calls the principium individuationis, that is, from the Latin, the principle of individuation, by which human beings, and indeed all things, can be recognized as what they are in contradistinction to what they are not. So distinguished from all other things and permitted to stand forth as discrete entities or individuals. So it's really the Apollonian that allows me to be me, and I achieve that in part through being reflected back to myself in the condition of dreams, where what in my waking life is remote because I'm not conscious of it, but in any case, there's some sort of churning, deeply important activity going on below the thetic level of awareness or self-consciousness. That material in the dream space is reflected back to me as a kind of image in which I can see myself more clearly. Okay. So I see in the chat, looks like a lot like Martin Van Buren. Yeah, that's funny. There's actually, if I can find it, I'll show it to you guys next time. There's a really hilarious meme where the technology, it's actually pretty impressive. This technology where I'm sure you've seen it used with celebrities and so forth. You can take an image of an older person and present what they would have looked like as a child. Well, someone did that with a number of philosophers. So there's Hegel, Kant is there, Nietzsche's in there, Kierkegaard, I can't remember, Wittgenstein, and they all look like teenagers. And then it shows Schopenhauer as just what he looked like now, or, in the 19th century. And it said, here's a kind of projected image of what these philosophers looked like as children. And Schopenhauer apparently looked like an 80-year-old man in his youth. So it's pretty funny. But so here's what I was getting at earlier in terms of that dithyrambic chorus. So now we're talking about the Dionysian impulse. So here's some like frat bros getting drunk. One of them apparently has a Foster's. I'm not sure where this is actually taking place. I don't know these people. I just found this image on the internet. So they could very well be in Australia. But this is from the text on the Dionysian impulse versus the Apollonian. So at this very collapse of the principium individuationis, we shall gain an insight into the Dionysian, which is brought home to us most intimately, perhaps by the analogy of drunkenness. It is either under the influence of the narcotic draught, which we hear in the songs of all primitive men and peoples, or with the potent coming of spring penetrating all nature with joy, that these Dionysian emotions awake, which, as they intensify, cause the subjective to vanish into complete self-forgetfulness. And so that's interesting too, if you recall, the Greek concept of truth is rendered aletheia, which means unhiddenness. And the root of aletheia is Lethe, which is one of the 6 mythic rivers, which would plunge you into a state of oblivion or forgetfulness if you were to swim in it or drink of the waters. So then there's something about the Dionysian impulse which puts you in a place not of falsity. It's not opposed to the truth, as we see in Nietzsche's formulation of this, but in a state of, you might say, more originary truth. And what that means will become clearer when we get closer to the end of this reading for Thursday. But whereas the Apollonian mirrors, as I was just describing, especially in the case of dreams, whereas the Apollonian impulse mirrors your subjectivity back to yourself, usually in the dream appearance, or when engaged in the production of the plastic arts, for example, the Dionysian dissolves the principle of individuation, making you forget yourself as an individual, making you lose your egoic status, in the manner, as I depict here in this image, of happy drunks, how they often find themselves in a state of completely immersive, happy fellow feeling or sympathy with others, lacking all restraint or any kind of self-awareness. So they don't care that they look silly or ridiculous, and they're not even aware that they do, because the boundaries that distinguish themselves from others, that separate one human from another, or indeed the human species from nature as such, those boundaries are broken down precisely by this Dionysian impulse. So I'm checking the chat. You'd go to Hegel over Schopenhauer. Yeah, the guy looks pretty pissed off. He was pissed off. Another funny anecdote about Schopenhauer, once he was in his apartment working, and the cleaning lady in the building where he lived was making too much noise. So he went out and basically pushed her down the stairs. And she tried many years unsuccessfully to sue Schopenhauer for that, and finally won, thankfully. and Schopenhauer had to compensate her financially for her suffering. Okay. So far so good. Any questions, or does anything need clarification? Well, moving to section 2. So from section 1, we should all be on the same page in terms of how these impulses, vis-a-vis what human beings do them in life and consciousness, how they emerge from the very forces of nature as such. And that makes sense insofar as we are, in fact, a part of nature, but we're a part of nature that's peculiarly conscious. And so it's that space of separation made possible by the function of consciousness, which effectively makes room for the work of these contrary impulses in our lives. So in section 2, Nietzsche characterizes the effective manifestation of the 2 art impulses in human art. So the first section was about how these arise from nature in itself, in human experience and self-recognition. And now he's talking about how these impulses work in human art, where it's not nature that's the artist, so to speak, but it's the human. So the Apollonian is most at work in the so-called plastic or formative arts of sculpture and non-musical poetry, And so sculpture and non-musical poetry, for example, generate more or less clear forms. So Homer's epic poetry is non-musical. Another way to say that would be non-lyrical. And so this is why Nietzsche categorizes Homer as the naive artist par excellence, because Homer is satisfied, grounded in this sort of Apollonian orientation to the world, in generating a huge variety of images of heroic action and heroic overcoming. And of course, there are elements of tragedy at play here too, but unlike the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, if you're seeing these stories take place in a Homeric epic setting, they're always presented and articulated from the vantage of a third-person narrator, right? And so this is something that we learned already from Aristotle, what separates the tragic form of poetry from the epic, right? So that's sort of assumed or taken for granted in this context by Nietzsche. So sculpture and non-musical poetry, so you can take a sculpture of the god Zeus or the god Apollo, for example, or look at the images of heroes like Achilles or Ajax or Odysseus from Homer's epic poems, and you can see more or less clear forms. So when you're reading a Homeric epic, you can generate pictures, more or less clear images of the actions taking place, almost like you're watching a film. So I hope you don't imagine, say, Brad Pitt when you're reading Homer because of the unfortunate Wolfgang Petersen film of the Iliad. But in any case, however you see these heroic figures, you can conjure up with very little difficulty, owing to the power and success, the technical refinement of Homer's poetic language. You can conjure up more or less clear forms. While the Dionysian, in the first place, gives rise, as we've discussed already, to music. And so music, in its most primitive state, expresses powerful, dangerous, non-conceptual passions and desires. And Nietzsche, as you might have picked up on already, is hugely committed to the overarching significance of music. So I think I mentioned this at a different point this term, but Nietzsche famously said, "Without music, life would be a mistake." So he really did elevate music above the other arts, I think. And so music can express these often dangerous, non-conceptual passions, and since they're non-conceptual, they don't easily lend themselves to clear forms or images. And so music, as we talked about in the context of Ion, is ecstatic. So one is literally standing outside of oneself. One is beside oneself. One no longer thinks of oneself in a rigid, formal way as an I or an ego. And then it's the marriage of the two impulses, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, clarity and obscurity, order and chaos, that produces this singular art form known as the tragedy. So in 502, he says, with reference to these immediate art states of nature, so we're considering nature as an artist, every artist is an imitator, that is to say, either an Apollonian artist in dreams or a Dionysian artist in ecstasies, or finally, as for example in Greek tragedy, at once artist in both dreams and ecstasies. So he's saying, even if you dream at night, you don't consider yourself an artist in the traditional sense. You are in any case an imitative or a mimetic artist, to the extent that you are participating in this Apollonian impulse. And if you're one of these great revelers or drunken bros, you can even be considered an artist there, but not an artist of Apollonian dreamscapes, but instead an artist of drunken ecstasy. And then tragedy, as its own unique art form, emerges as a marriage of these. And so from this point of view, we can say that Nietzsche's rethinking this Aristotelian definition that we encountered weeks ago of art as the imitation of nature. So memisi ti phusis, coming from the Greek, from Aristotle and his Poetics. And so let me see. Yeah, so on pages 505 to 506, so I'll jump down to that real quick since we're almost out of time, because I wanted to get to this. This seems to be an account given by Nietzsche to make sense of the very origin of art as we know it, as we come to recognize it as a component of, let's say, human spirit. Right, so on pages 505 and 506, he says, the Greek knew and felt the terror and horror of existence. That he might endure this terror at all, he had to interpose between himself and life the radiant dream birth of the Olympians. So I would suggest that for Nietzsche, that's a kind of account of why art arises in human life in the first place. And we can see it in the historical context of the Greek sensitivity to the horror of existence, to the shittiness of reality, which they transformed, as we see in tragedy itself, into the very highest pinnacle of what's possible in the arts. And so he also gives an account, where we're almost out of time here, but the account of how the sphere of beauty comes about. And that's a tension between Dionysian suffering in the face of the terrors of nature, because of which you would want to lose yourself in this kind of orgiastic, wanton, chaotic releasement of energies. And then the Apollonian self-mirroring in the Greek pantheon, where the Greek is reflected back to herself, but now lighter, improved, in short, godlike. And this is why the Olympian gods, unlike the Titanic gods that they overthrew, are robustly anthropomorphic. Because these gods like Zeus and Apollo and Athena and indeed Dionysus, they are like ourselves, reflected on, say, to appeal to 20th and 21st century art forms, a cinema screen, where we're seeing pieces of ourselves in this pantheon, but lighter, devoid of any sort of gravity, and ultimately purged of what is regrettable in human life. So it's as if religion then, in the Greek world, developed out of the way in which, in the dream, the individual reflects their darkest aspects of themselves that are typically hidden into a series of images. Well, that's sort of where the gods came from, according to Nietzsche. All right. So does this stuff make sense so far? You guys enjoying it? Are you liking Nietzsche? A little bit? No?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, okay, cool. All right, guys. So I'll let us go. We'll close it here. And on Thursday, yeah, we'll continue this conversation. I look forward to the presentation, and I really look forward to reading your midterm papers. All right. So hit me up, send me an email if you have any questions, and
Okay.
I'll see you guys on Thursday. And I'll send you an email, Joshua, about meeting tomorrow.
Okay. Sounds good.
See ya.
See ya.